Hi Noshers, my name is Micah, the host of Not Your Bubby's Nosh, a conversation about your favorite and least favorite Jewish foods, your go-to source for holiday meal inspiration, and a place to discuss and kvetch about which bubby made it best. Hello and welcome, my fellow Noshers, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited for this guest of mine. Her name is Kat Romanow, and she lives in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, my home country, where I'm from, and I have fallen madly in love with Kat over the past year that we've gotten to know one another and shared our love for all things Jewish food. A little bit about Kat is that she is, as I mentioned, a Jewish food historian, a recipe developer, and food photographer based in Montreal. Her background includes an MA in Judaic Studies and Food Studies, and a position as the Director of Food Programming at the Museum of Jewish Montreal, where she created the walking tour Beyond the Bagel, founded Fletcher's Espace Culinaire, a restaurant serving modern Jewish food. Kat is so passionate about using food as a medium to teach people about Jewish culture and history. And she is just a wealth of knowledge. Whenever I have a question about the history or origins of Jewish food, she is the first person I run to. Also, when I'm looking to discuss my love for bagels with someone, she is always wearing bagel gear. And I would definitely check her out. She is on Instagram as The Wandering Chew, CHEW, cute little pun. So thank you so much, Kat, for joining me. You are amazing. I want to be you. I want to be your best friend. I want to live with you. Let's get into Jewish food. First, we'll just get you to tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do.
So I'm a Jewish food historian, and I am the co-founder of The Wandering Chew, which is a not-for-profit based in Montreal. And our goal is to tell a diversity of Jewish stories through food.
That's amazing. I don't think that I see that very often in cities. And I think it's so important to share that diversity and also recognize that there is diversity in Jewish food, especially in places like Montreal or New York, when you think like automatically Jewish deli, and that's what people think Jewish food is.
Exactly. Yeah. And when you dig, you actually find that there's so many interesting and like different Jewish stories out there and Jewish foods.
Yeah, I love that. And how do you get into that? Like, is that something that you were always passionate about growing up? Does it reflect your experience growing up? Tell me more about how you got into it.
It does not reflect my experience growing up. I grew up in an Italian, Ukrainian household, but the Italian was a very strong influence in my life because my great grandfather built a bakery on the street I grew up on, and it was an Italian bakery, and he also built houses for all his kids on the same street. So I grew up next to this Italian bakery called Corona Bakery. That was such a big influence in my life. You know, like on Christmas morning, we would eat pizza from the bakery, and and I would run around the bakery. Yeah, it was delicious. And, you know, I'd run around the bakery when I was younger. But my entry into Jewish food was really, I was introduced to it when I was in university. I studied religion. I majored in religion. And the woman who became my MA advisor one day mentioned that you could study Jewish food. And it was like a light bulb went off. And I was like, I want to do that. And I don't have many of those. I'm usually it takes me a while to make a decision. But in that moment, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so I started studying Jewish food. And then at the same time, also thinking about converting. So those two things kind of happened at the same time. And I became a Jewish food historian and a Jew concurrently.
I think that's so amazing. And for those of you who don't know anyone who have gone through the conversion process, like it's a really involved process. And like I've always said that someone who converts knows 1,000 times more about being Jewish than I do. And like I grew up Jewish, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I knew all the ins and outs. And I think the dedication and the time and just the passion for Judaism with someone who's gone through the conversion process is just like so amazing. Like you know so much, first of all, about Jewish food, but also probably just, like I said, like way more about being Jewish than me, which is so cool. And I love that you did that. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's probably a lot of similarities between maybe what you did growing up in terms of cultural and familial aspects and food aspects of growing up in an Italian, Ukrainian home and in a Jewish home.
Yeah. No, I think you're totally right about that. And there was, when I started writing my thesis and doing the field work and interviewing people, whenever I went into a home, the first thing people would do would be like, they would bring me to their kitchen and feed me. And it felt so familiar because that was the thing that, when I went over to family members' homes, like that's the first thing you do. You go to the kitchen. And even though, my upbringing was very different, it at the same time felt so familiar.
For your family, or do they learn about Jewish holidays now through food, through you?
Yeah. Basically, yes. Jewish food has been my entry into Judaism, and now it's the way that they learn about it. They get to, my parents will come over for Shabbat dinners, and my mom is great and comes to so many of my events. So she gets to learn about, Jewish food through the events that I'm running as well, through the Wandering Shoe. So they've been really great about it. And, and also since I've had a son, they're trying to also like marry our two cultures and bring my mom will get Hannukah gifts and Christmas gifts. And so it's very sweet.
It's so cute. I think that food is definitely like the gateway into any or most cultures. And so it's like the gateway to like understanding a group of people. There's so much about it. And we've connected before about how if I ever went back to school, I would want to do a program in like food anthropology and food history. So I'm your fangirl. Anyways, and I'm like, you're the coolest person ever. I'm low-key obsessed with you. We just have this mutual obsession with one another. That's borderline unhealthy, but it's fine. It's totally fine. It's okay. It's beautiful. Understand. I know. I'm like tearing up and getting emotional about it. And because everything makes me tear up. But let's get into food. So you're in Montreal and you host bagel tours, right? And you talk about bagels all the time. You have the Welcome to Beyond the Bagel, which I think is a fantastic idea and concept. And that's all based on Montreal style bagels. And so there is an age old battle of New York versus Montreal and now versus California, whatever that means, bagels. So how are they different and what makes Montreal bagels 1,000 times better than any other bagel on the planet? There's no contest. Even your shirt says, I love Montreal bagels.
It does, right? Yeah. And I'm glad we agree on this fact, this basic fact that
it's a fundamental value. Fundamental value right here.
I rep it every day by wearing the shirt. Yeah, but Montreal bagels are smaller, denser, and sweeter than we'll talk about New York bagels as the reference point here because I think that's the most well-known comparison, but they're, so smaller, denser, and sweeter than a New York bagel and have a bigger hole. I think is also very special about them is they're rolled by hand and then boiled in honey water. So what that does is the sugar and the honey allows crispy crust to be formed while it's baking. And then they're baked in a wood-fired oven. And those, I think the hand rolling, the honey water, and the wood-fired oven are really what, make a Montreal bagel a Montreal bagel. In New York, there are some people rolling their bagels by hand, but I think in large part they are no longer rolled by hand.
Yeah, just more care and tender loving for the Montreal bagels.
and I think it really carries on that tradition that came over from Eastern Europe of hand rolling bagels. And so you have this link to the past, to bagel history that is still alive in Montreal, which I think is really amazing.
So tell us a little bit about bagel history.
Favorite thing to talk about.
I know. And we'll be here for the next 12 hours.
Yes. So get ready. Get a drink.
I'm ready. Yeah. Sitting on the floor with my coffee.
There are a few theories as to the family origins of bagels. You find ring-shaped breads that are boiled then baked in many cultures around the world, dating back thousands of years. More recently, Reem Kassis, a cookbook author, points to a recipe for kak, which is a ring-shaped bread that's boiled and baked that was included in a 13th century Arabic cookbook. So you have this family line going all the way back to the 13th century. We also find a tradition of boiling and baking that was brought to Italy, particularly in the Puglia area or in Puglia, and it became the tarallo. And then it's thought that this style of baking then traveled to Poland with a noble woman who moved from Italy to Poland to become queen. There are also theories that the pretzel was brought to Poland from Germany, which is another boiled and baked bread. So there are a few theories, but ultimately it is in Poland where the bagel really becomes the bagel that we know today, the Jewish bread that we know today. And in Poland, you have a bread called the oberjanek, and it is a boiled and baked ring-shaped bread. And so as Jews settled in Poland, Jewish bakers started making oberjaneks, but they ended up calling them bagels. And then ultimately, as more and more Jews started making bagels, the name, more and more people started calling them bagels. And so that name stuck. And that is in large part what they became known as. You can still find oberjaneks in Poland today. So they are still a thing. But that's really the closest family relation.
It's so fascinating because I think now we just associate bagels with North American Jewry. And when I was living in London, it was impossible to find a decent bagel. And I was oh, well, maybe it's just a North American thing. But it isn't. It comes from not only Poland, but also with roots in the Middle East as well, which I think is probably surprising for most people, and myself included, when I learned that. And I think something so everyday for us now, it didn't just appear, right? It had to get there somewhere.
And I think that's what's interesting when you this is not particularly about the bagel, but just about food history. When you dig into things and start learning about where your food comes from, it's so interesting to see that there are connections around the world, and nothing is kind of in a silo, right? There are always connections that you can find, and it's interesting how food travels and evolves and becomes becomes iconic in one place, but if when you go back, you see links to other places as well. So it kind of speaks to the interconnectedness of us all.
That's beautiful. I love that. I love that. And so we know where bagels more or less came from. And then we know that there's a difference between Montreal and New York bagels, but are there any actual historical differences, or is it just how people have adapted the recipe from two different places?
I think ultimately that's what it was, I think when they first arrived in North America, both, in New York and in Montreal, they arrived in North America in the late 1800s when, Eastern European Jews were leaving Europe because of economic hardships and pogroms, and they brought their food with them when they settled here. And I think if we could go back to that time, we'd probably find that the bagels in both cities were quite similar, right? They were probably both all being made by hand, baked in wood-fired ovens. I've read historical information about how on the Lower East Side, there were hundreds and hundreds of bagel bakeries, and they were very hot places because of these wood-fired ovens. So all of this points to bagels being very similar. And I think it's just how they then developed in each place. While in Montreal, they stayed true to that more traditional recipe. I think it also speaks to the fact that Montrealers are quite a traditional Like, we can be traditional when it comes to food. And then in New York, you had that evolution that I think the influence of a bagel rolling machine in the 60s that came out. So that really changed what bagels look like. And then just how the people making them developed the recipes.
I think like you don't find very many hand rolled bagels. And here in San Francisco, I think that there's a couple because we're very like artisanal here. You know, it's like the more time it takes, the more money us Bay Area folks are willing to pay for it. But there is one or two that does a wood fired oven, but they are still noticeably different than a Montreal style bagel, like the shape. They're so good. And that's one of my favorite bagels in the city, but I don't know if they use the honey water, and the base is typically sourdough here because us San Franciscans can only eat things that have been fermented. Apparently, we're too hip to do anything else. We're too hip for yeast. But it is interesting because even if some of these places in New York or San Francisco or wherever in the country or Canada, States, wherever you are, even if we're still employing some of those methods of like hand rolling or honey water or wood firing, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a Montreal bagel either. And I think that that's pretty interesting how everywhere is kind of taken their own spin and variation on it. But as we've already come to agreement is that Montreal bagel is still the best and no one can replicate it. And I'm very envious of you because a Montreal bagel doesn't even need to be cut open in half to enjoy, right? It just has to be eaten hot and fresh out of the bag with sesame seeds spilling down your shirt. So that's
exactly it.
Yeah.
And preferably at 3 a.m. Right?
I've never done that.
Oh, so, because just as a little quick note about Montreal bagel culture for everyone is Montreal bagel shops, the iconic ones, St. Theodore Bagels and Fairmount Bagels, are open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So you can literally get a bagel at any time, a hot bagel at any time in Montreal. And so that quintessential Montreal experience is going out for drinks with friends, and bars stay open till 3 a.m. here. So, you leave a bar at 3 a.m. and you head to one of the bagel shops and get a bag of fresh bagels and just eat them on the sidewalk in front of the bagel shops, which are always covered in sesame seeds.
That sounds like heaven, because here the bagels are so fancy that they're so limited that if you go for a bagel after 10:30 in the morning, you are only getting plain or sold out. So it is the Wild West out here. Like it is dog eat dog when it comes to bagels because they sell out because I don't know why, but you cannot get a hot bagel and none of them are hot. They've all been pre-baked. So just one more reason to go visit Montreal and take the Beyond Bagel walking tour and get a hot bagel. And if you guys hit it off, maybe you'll take them out at 3 a.m. for a hot bagel after a couple drinks or when your son wakes you up in the middle of the night, more like it probably these days.
The drinks are not happening anymore.
just a midnight wake up call, little walk with your little one. But we can digress from bagels because I know you and I can probably talk about it forever, but somehow it's almost Hannukah time. I feel like it's just around the corner this year. I don't know where it went. I don't know where I am, but I would love to talk about Hannukah. And there's obviously our classic Hannukah foods like our latkes and our soufganiyot and I don't know, chocolate gelt. What else do we make on Hannukah? But I'd love to talk about their history and why we associate fried foods. I know that obviously it's because of the oil lasting for 8 nights, but I know that you probably have some much more interesting tidbits than my regurgitation from Jewish Sunday school. And I'd love to hear a little bit about that from your perspective.
So for much of history, Hanukkah was actually held a minor status as a holiday. And initially, there weren't any specific festival dishes associated with the holiday. It was only around the 14th century that 2 types of food became popular symbols of the holidays. And these were dairy foods and fried foods. So we'll talk about dairy foods for a second, because I think that's an interesting one that people don't often associate with the holiday. And that tradition has a really interesting story that goes along with it as to why we should eat dairy foods on Hanukkah. And so there's this apocryphal story of Judith, who was living in a village, and the Assyrian army laid siege to the village. So what she did in order to save her village from, the army, is that she went to see the general of the army. His name was Holofernes. And there's lots of representations of this in Renaissance art. So if you Google Judith and Holofernes, you'll see the story depicted in paintings. So she went to visit him, gave him lots of salty cheese to eat. And then he was really thirsty. So she gave him many, many cups of wine. And he ultimately got very drunk and fell asleep. And then she chopped off his head, saving the town from the Assyrian army.
Oh my goodness. I love that in all of these holidays, I've been learning more about these just like badass ladies who are just getting the job done. Exactly. And I feel like that's like a recurring theme that I never picked up on as a kid, obviously, because you have to learn more about some of these stories to get it. And damn.
Well, because the Maccabee story is the story that they teach everyone, right? Totally. And it's all about the men and rededicating the temple. But it's like, no, there's this amazing like girl power story that is hiding right there.
Go Judith.
We actually, we need to, maybe we should make some merch that says like, go Judith. I know.
Channeling my inner Judith.
Yeah.
Just like gave them so much cheese and then wine. They're incapacitated and then decapitated.
There you go.
Wow. Okay. That got me like really riled up. Okay, keep going.
Well, we once hosted an event called Killer Cheese and Girl Power for Hannukah. We're all about celebrating that of strong Jewish women at the Wandering Shoe, because I started it with two other strong Jewish women. So we like these stories. But getting back to the dairy, so that is where this tradition of eating dairy on Hannukah comes from, because Judith was apparently related to Judah Maccabee. In line with this dairy tradition, the first latkes, we think of latkes and we think of potato latkes these days, right? But the first latkes that were made, they were being made by Italian Jews in the Middle Ages, and they were made with cheese and fried. So more like a ricotta latke. It's like you're looking for something to compare it to. And they usually didn't contain any sugar, and they were usually accompanied by like a fruit preserve or honey. And so they became this popular Hannukah food because they fulfilled both the tradition of eating dairy, because they were made with cheese, and they were fried in a frying pan. So you have the two main culinary traditions of the holiday in this one dish. And so they are like the OG latkes. And
that is so cool.
We have a recipe for ricotta latkes with persimmon jam. So there's that really interesting tradition. And it's only as latkes made their way to Eastern Europe. I think what's interesting is they became known as latkes because they're related to the Ukrainian word for pancake, which is odlatka. And but dairy and cheese were luxury items during the winter in Eastern Europe and northeastern Europe, and the primary frying fat was schmaltz. So you weren't going to be making dairy or cheese latkes and then frying it in schmaltz. So they were more often initially made with rye or buckwheat flour, and some people even made latkes with like turnips, which I guess it's a root vegetable, and you're frying it up, so it kind of makes sense. And then it was in the mid 1800s that the potato gained acceptance in Eastern Europe. And that's when you have when the potato latke that we know today really came to be. So it's actually a pretty recent invention.
So interesting.
Yeah. I hope I'm not being too nerdy about all this. But
I'm like eating this up. I'm like, cancel the rest of my meetings today. I just want to like sit and watch you talk. I think, and that is so interesting because like I work in the Jewish food space, obviously. I had no idea that dairy was a thing during Hannukah. And you just kind of assume that every latke that ever existed was made of potato. Because when I've ever posted a recipe or made a recipe that's like a different root vegetable, there's two groups of people. One person's like, that's amazing. Then the other group of people's like, you have killed the latke, and hates it. But I'm like, maybe in the past, we didn't have a potato. We had to be inventive. But I've never made one. Actually, I did make some that was like a cacio e pepe latke. Not with pasta, but I just added like a whole ton of Parmesan and black pepper. And I didn't use any onions in my potato latke. And it was chef's kiss. It was really nice. It was just like really savory and like a little bit cheesy, but not too much. It was nice. So
I need to make those this year.
Yeah. It is so interesting because the foods that we know today that we just accept as this is what they've always been, they've not always been like that. And I think that's the common theme of probably your learnings and what you've told me and whoever's listening is that things have evolved and things are probably going to continue to evolve based on what we have available and technology and a whole host of things. And so I think that it's pretty cool that latkes we're not always potato.
Yeah. So for all those haters, like who were like, no, you ruined the latke. No, you didn't. You just went back to its roots.
Thank you. Yeah. So really anything fried is basically a latke. A fried pancake is essentially a latke. It doesn't have to be potatoes.
It does not. No.
Story.
And we even made those buckwheat ones and they were, with a cranberry applesauce on them and they were really, really good.
That reminds me of like fry bread or like bannock, which we like would make as like kids in the prairies of Canada, which was basically just like fried dough and we'd put like preserves and stuff on it as well. And so there's so much overlap between different cultures and different places that our latke, as we know it, is a variation on someone else's fried something. And speaking of fried, like throughout the course of history as well, especially since it's turned into potato latkes, oil is not necessarily something that people had all the time, right? Like oil, there's scarcity in oil during like historical, like wartime and different times. And so you mentioned schmaltz as a method of making latkes, but also meat is also a luxury during many different times. So do you have an idea of like what Hannukah looked like maybe more recently in like the First or Second World War, where there was just like maybe there was less oil, there wasn't the ability to fry things. Like what did that look like?
That's a great question. And yeah, it is a hard one. Just thinking about it right now and thinking about how people ate in Eastern Europe. And I'm sure there are people like, I'm thinking of, Jeffrey Yoskowitz and Liz Alpern from the Gefilteria who could probably answer this better than me. But this is like based on kind of what I've read. As you mentioned, meat was scarce. You had meat at the time when you killed an animal, and that didn't happen. Like it wasn't a regular occurrence during the course of the year, right? There was a time to do that. And if I remember correctly, I believe that was close like in the fall, near the winter, right? When you would kill an animal and then you would have meat and you'd render the fat. And so you'd have these animal products for the winter when there wasn't much food available. And, you'd have root vegetables in your root cellar. So I guess when the time when Hannukah falls, you may still have some of that schmaltz available to you. So you would be able to fry up some latkes, whatever, whether it was a root vegetable one, a potato one, or a buckwheat one. But I think they wouldn't have been frying them in a ton of like oil, right? Like today, when you walk into a house during Hannukah, it like smells of oil and you're usually, deep frying things. And I don't think that would have happened in Eastern Europe. And there definitely probably wouldn't have been there probably would have been one thing that was deep fried as opposed to many things like donuts and all kinds of desserts as well. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I think it was maybe a pared back Hannukah, right, menu, right? So you'd have latkes and probably not, there probably wouldn't have been sour cream with it. It would have been maybe applesauce or even just eaten plain. And that's what it would have looked like, as opposed to the abundance of dishes that we have on our Hanukkah tables now.
I think also on that note, there was a lot more reusing likely at that time as well. Like many people probably don't know that you can like reuse your frying oil like 3 or 4 times as long as you strain it. And like I know I'm guilty of it when I fry latkes, which is actually all year round and pretty frequently. I like hate dealing with the oil, so I just like put it back in the oil jug and toss it. But you can reuse it, and I think that the concept of reusing and repurposing oil or ingredients was probably more prevalent then because they didn't have a choice. Whereas these days I can go to the grocery store and buy like a $5 jug of vegetable oil for my latkes and not blink an eye. So perhaps that was also something as well. So I'm going to call my Baba later anyways, and I'll be like, what did Hannukah look like? She'll be like, I don't know. We'll see if Baba Muriel remembers Hannukah in her early years. But I think that's probably, I mean, just the way that we eat now is so different anyways. Like we say sour cream, but like, is it vegan sour cream? Is it grass-fed milk sour cream? It's so, we're a fancy bunch these days when it comes to food. And I was reading something or my husband was reading, I don't know, one of us was reading because we have the same brain at this point, but like that we live infinitely better than like kings and queens did centuries ago. And so just the things that we take for granted when it comes to food, especially, those were such luxuries to be able to have meat at every meal if you're a meat eater, or have the choice to be a meat eater or not. Even that is probably so different than what it used to be.
Oh, totally. And even just like being able to eat dairy on a daily basis. Dairy was something you ate in the spring when after, baby animals, or calves, or, whatever animal was born and the mother was producing milk. It wasn't a thing that happened that you had access to all year round. So that that milk you're pouring into your coffee, if it's cow's milk, like we are lucky to be able to do that every day.
Yeah, and they didn't have the technology to milk almonds back then either.
No,
they didn't know. Yeah, or anything at this point. I've even seen potato milk. So
wow.
We milk everything, which they couldn't do back then. It was like milk or bust, and only for a few months of the year.
There you go.
Yeah, take that. No oat creamer in your coffee that tastes like coffee cake or whatever. No coffee mate for you. But back to Hannukah. So I would love to know what's on your Hannukah menu, especially as someone who grew up in an Italian household. Like, is there an intersection between those two food groups? And what are your go-tos for Hannukah?
Over the years, right, because I didn't grow up with Hannukah menu. So I have, as a Jew by choice, right, I get to kind of make up my holiday menus and not feel like I need to make certain things because my family always made them, which is kind of liberating and fun and so much fun. And over the years for Hannukah, I've developed many recipes for the holiday through with the Wandering Chew for our events and also for newspaper articles that I've been interviewed for. So there was one year where I got to develop some non-potato latke recipes. And my favorite out of that bunch was celery root latkes that I serve with a smoked salmon creme fraiche. And so it's celery root, onions, chives. And celery root has like a faintly celery taste, but not as assertive as celery.
I think celery root is like an unsung hero of the vegetable aisle. Personally, you can do so many things with celery root. So yeah, I'm very into that.
So celery root latkes have become like the thing I make every year now because I love it. So that will always be on my Hannukah menu, as well as the ricotta latkes with persimmon jam that I mentioned earlier. But getting to that intersection of my identities, I'm always very excited when Hannukah falls over Christmas, and it does this year. And so when that happens, I draw from my Italian food heritage. And there's a tradition, and this happens both in the States as well as in Canada, but on Christmas Eve, there's a tradition of eating fish, and it's called the Feast of Seven Fishes. So you're supposed to eat 7 different kinds of fish, and it's really an Italian tradition that developed in North America. So when this happens, I will bring in a dish that my mom always made, or my mom and my grandmother always made for Christmas Eve, and it's bacala, or salted cod, with thinly sliced potatoes and thinly sliced onions. And so you soak the salted cod to rehydrate it, and then layer it with the thinly sliced potatoes and onions, and then drizzle it with olive oil, some salt and pepper, and bake that. So that will always make an appearance on my table. And where I'm going with this menu is a mix of like fried things and fish. So it's like a fish menu with fried things in there as well. So I'll make potato latkes, but then top them with like smoked salmon and creme fraiche and chives, or with smoked whitefish salad, which I really, really love. On top of potato latke is like heaven for me. My mom also makes this salmon mousse, which it feels very Jewish because it's just like this salmon mousse. Yeah. And she actually makes it in a mold, which is amazing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that feels very post-synagogue lunch to me.
Exactly. Yes. And then it's made with dairy. So that just feels so appropriate for the holiday. And so there's the dairy in there as well. And then I was also thinking about this, and then like an ideal world, I think this year I want to add maybe some fried gefilte fish bites with horseradish mayo to the table.
Yeah.
I used to, because I ran a restaurant at the Museum of Jewish Montreal when I worked there. And I used to make gefilte fish club sandwich. So we made our own gefilte fish and then warmed it up and served it on challah with horseradish mayo and romaine lettuce. And it was amazing. So I was like calling back to that. And I'm like, instead of putting it in a sandwich, I'm just going to fry up the bites of gefilte fish.
I'm a gefilte fish lover. And so that sounds fantastic. Actually, for Passover this past year, I made like gefilte fish, like fried fish cakes instead of like boiled gefilte fish, because I was like, this is more appetizing to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I love gefilte fish, don't get me wrong, but I made like little fish cakes, and then I made a beet and horseradish pickled egg to go on top, which was yummy, and then like some pickled veggies. So yeah, that sounds delicious.
Wow. And then maybe some fried sardines as well, because frying. So it's really, I'm trying to marry those two traditions.
I love that.
I promise I'll take photos of everything I make this year.
Yes, please. That sounds absolutely amazing. And I wish I could transport myself to your Hannukah table, but maybe one year I'll just show up on your door. Like,
you are more than welcome.
I wish. I feel like my parents would be like, you never even come to see us for Hannukah. Why are you going to see her? Like, whatever.
We're soulmates.
I know. Yeah. Sorry, guys. I'm never with family for Hannukah. We usually go on a trip. So we'll be in Chile this year. We'll just eat something fried that day. And you can get like an app on your phone for like a virtual menorah.
That's fun.
You like tap to light it and everything. We do our best. We're very millennial. We're a millennial Jewish couple, you know? I think that sounds fantastic. And it's fun to see how you've melded the cultures, and you're honoring both of them. And I think that's such a cool thing for you to be able to share with your son, but also your family who didn't grow up, who doesn't have the Jewish background, you being a Jew by choice. And I think that is just so cool. I love that. I know I appreciate
that. Yeah. Thank you. That's so nice of you to say. Yeah. And I think it's, when I converted, there was that thought of like not wanting to alienate my parents in any way. And I want them to know that I still value the traditions and heritage I was brought up with. So it's nice to feel that there is space for me to do that now in the Jewish world.
Yeah, I think that you just having that conscious thought about it just shows how much you care about both of those things. And I assume that many people wouldn't even have that thought, or other family members might not have that thought so front and center in their mind. So I think it sounds like you're doing a really solid job of like bringing them both together and honoring both and leaning into your Judaism, which I think is really cool. And especially when someone's a Jew by choice like that, like I think that Jews everywhere are like, we all have to wake up every day and be like, I'm a Jew by choice, because it is a conscious choice to be Jewish for sure. But for someone who's taken so many steps and not just born into the choice, I think that so like, I don't know if honorable is the right word, but I don't know. I think it's just like really inspiring and cool, because to be a Jew isn't necessarily the easiest choice either. And we've seen that more and more over the past few years, that it's not an easy thing mentally, emotionally, physically, with the lactose intolerance and the gut issues that us Ashkenazi gals suffer with.
Oh, I have it too. I was meant to be a Jew.
Totally, yeah. So I think like we're all choosing how we celebrate our Judaism and choosing how we practice. And even if that's just like, I always say, like, if I'm having wine or bread or like sitting down on a Friday night for dinner, like that's how I Shabbat. And that is my choice to like open that bottle of wine on a Friday. Or if I'm eating pizza for dinner on a Friday, I'm like, I can say a little hamotzi over this bread, like this pizza crust, no problem. And I think that that's especially now more than ever, where it feels like a big choice, just honoring it in a way that feels good. So I think you're killing it. You're doing great.
And also I have to say, I love, like, I've seen your post about, just doing Shabbat however you can, and in whatever way you can, was just such a nice reminder to give myself some grace, and that it's okay if I'm just, having pizza, or we like have wine and say the blessing over wine, and then eat takeout. Like, that's enough.
Totally. Yeah. And one thing one thing that we do every Friday, even if there's no wine, bread, or anything, is we've always done this. We do like Friday gratefuls, and that's like our little thing for Shabbat. So even if we don't say a single blessing, like every Friday, we each have to share 5 things that we're grateful for, and we just go back and forth. And some weeks it's like really hard. I'm like, I don't know what I'm grateful for this week, because we're not allowed to say grateful for each other. Like, that's the rule. It's like, we can't, that's a cop out, because that's a given.
Yeah.
One. But that's been like our little tradition, where even if we're not doing anything, like, I'm using air quotes, but like Shabbati, that's not a word, but I made it into one. Shabbat-ish.
It should be.
It's Shabbish. I just made that word. Even if it's not Shabbat, like themed, it's like just like a moment to like take a little second and pause and reflect, or anything like that. So I think that no matter how you do it is the right way for you, right? And I think that that's something that's sometimes forgotten in younger generations, because there's a lot of pressure to do it a certain way, whether it's from what you see online or your family, friends, or just like maybe what you would have learned in some of your conversion classes. Again, because 10 times more than most Jews who are born into Judaism. So I think that just giving yourself grace to be like, I can practice it however I want. And like, as long as I'm choosing to practice it, it's totally fine. So I think that that's our takeaway. And I think you're killing it. And you know that I'm obsessed with you. So
you're giving me all the feels. I wish I could hug you right now. You're going to be on my grateful list this week.
Oh my God. You're going to be on my grateful list this week. Okay. Well, this has been so amazing. I'm going to make sure that we get you for every holiday, so that you and I just even more excuses. Oh my God, I'm crying. I'm not crying. You're crying.
Oh.
One second, love. Why am I so emotional? Let me restart that. Okay. This has been so amazing to chat with you and learn more about Hannukah foods and bagels, and just all the information that you have in your beautiful head is just like inspiring and amazing. And I think that we all have so much to learn from you about food and Jewish stuff, and just raising a family in a Jewish way that feels genuine to you. And so thank you so much for having this conversation with me today.
It was such a pleasure. I just feel so happy from our conversation and excited. And I really can't wait to, hopefully this is the first of many things that we get to do together.
Not Your Bubby's Nosh is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network and is produced by Jew Folk Inc. For more shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast. If you've got questions, email me at Micah@noshwithmicah.com.